Welcome, everyone. Such a joy to see all of you on the snow moon, the full moon of February. Such a pleasure to be able to assemble with everyone. I always am so grateful that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to join us for this hour. And before we begin, we always have a practice here, which is called the land acknowledgement. I am on the Haldeman Tract. This is land that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River and its traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. I'm deeply grateful to be on this territory. It's a reminder that how much we owe to the land and to one another, to come from a place of creativity and generosity, but also justice. So I invite you, wherever you are on planet Earth, if you know the traditional name of the lands that you're on, to enter that into the chat stream, and we'll just become more aware of where everyone is and of our obligations to all creatures, great and small, and to those who've gone before us and to those to whom we owe a great debt. Thank you for that. So you are in the life writing session. If you didn't want to be here, then now's your time to bail and do something completely different. This is a really interesting world, the spiritual life writing world. Life writing, if you're familiar with it, is an integrative art. It brings together memory and experience. But spiritual life writing invites the whole self in. Memory, experience, fact, feeling, imagination, the profane, and the sacred. So we offer these sessions to help you find your authentic voice and to shed whatever fears make you hold your tongue. Our 2022 webinars, we're sort of branching out from where we were last year, and we have an extra kind of emphasis this year on inclusivity and diversity as it relates to making the spiritual part of our life experience visible and valued. And that's one of the reasons I'm really pleased that Hollay Ghadery is my special guest for tonight. I'm going to introduce her in a moment. Tonight's session is called The Cosmic Script. So riffing on the ancient art of Islamic calligraphy, Hollay explores an entirely different take on the cosmic script in her incredible memoir of mixed race identity and mental health called Fuse. She does so with power, humor, irreverence, and with love. A writer and editor living on the Anishinaabe land in rural Ontario, Canada, Hollay has her MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph. You can find her in fine literary magazines, including Malahat, Room, Carousel, Antigonish Review, Grain, The Fiddlehead, and so on. Her debut collection of poetry, Rebellion Box, is due out next spring with Radiant Press. So excited to speak to. Can you highlight my guest? Where is she? Ah. So you need to be unmuted, and maybe yeah. There you are. Okay. And so Mary Jean, can you unmute her?
Oh, yes. I can invite her to unmute. You'll have to unmute yourself, Hollay.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, there we are. Fantastic.
It's like, why am I facing this way? Story of my life.
That's the perfect entry. That's the perfect entry into this session. That is fantastic. So welcome. It's absolute joy for that you're here and that you're going to join us. I'm really excited about this. So I have to say, so this is our second conversation that you and I have had, because your work is relatively new to me. So I'm really excited to introduce you to this crowd. It's a very interesting crowd of people. But I first came across your work through the editorial capacity, the work you do as an editor, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So just tell us a bit about your background and where spirituality fits into your writing, your family, wherever you want to take us. Just start us on that path.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. My background. So I'm Iranian and of British Isles descent. I was brought up Islamic, but Islamic, whenever my father felt like we should be Islamic, whenever he felt that we were straying and, he needed to give us a lesson. But, I went to mosque only once in my life. My mother was a convert to Islam, so she could marry my father. Didn't really practice. We celebrated, all the typical Anglo-Saxon holidays. My mom was actually the one that had us celebrating Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which is on the 21st of March every year, so first day of spring. My mom was the one who introduced us to that. My father kind of wants to leave a lot of his cultural past behind him. And yeah, so I grew up Islamic in a small town once we moved from Toronto. So it was different, but we didn't really actively practice. So it wasn't in too many people's faces. But I was, because I looked different and I hadn't had a nose job yet, so I really stood out as Persian at the time. And it was very interesting having people ask me from a young age, are you Muslim, and all the negative connotations. So I've always tried to distance myself from at least my religious self, like my religious identity. And even spirituality was something that I tried to distance myself from, because I suffer from something called existential OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So I have a fixation on death and immortality and eternity. And so I say immortality, I meant mortality. And what will happen. And it's a really crippling fear. It's like that cold pool of fear in your stomach all the time. And I've suffered from that since I was around 5. So I've never known what to make of my spiritual life, because while I grew up with certain stories around, there is only one God and the Prophet Muhammad, and I always questioned them. I never believed it. I never believed any of it, even when I was more of a practicing Muslim. But I didn't disbelieve it either. And Susan, you said something that really stuck with me in our first meeting is, I guess I'm someone who lives with the questions now. I don't pretend to have the answers. So a lot of my creative life is spent addressing the questions and addressing them from as many different angles as possible. And there are infinite angles. So that is really what my creative life is about, at least in regards to spirituality.
That's incredible. There's so much packed into that answer. It's phenomenal. So existential OCD is probably not really familiar to everyone. OCD, I think maybe, there's a kind of packaging of that, but how did you come to understand that that's what you were carrying? I mean, from the time you were a small child to have that very clear bodily sensation. And then when did you find language for that, to sort of understand what it was that you were experiencing, or to be able to put it in a larger framework? 5-year-olds, we typically don't even use the word existential with a 5-year-old. So yeah, how did you come to that understanding about yourself? That's incredible.
I didn't come to have names for what was going on until I was in my 30s.
Wow.
I just was incredibly anxious. And in my early teens, I was put on drugs because of my anxiety and depression. And I started drinking and taking pharmaceutical drugs recreationally because of my issues when I was in my late teens, early 20s. But when I was younger, when I was a child, I was just terrified. And I couldn't get it out of my head, that the certainty that I was going to die and there was nothing I could do about it. And, my dad would tell me about heaven and my mom would tell me about heaven. And I was like, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. As a very young child, it would provide me zero comfort. And I think I discussed this in Fuse, but maybe if I'd been part of a religious community or a spiritual community, or been to a place of worship with any degree of regularity, then maybe it would have been different. But a lot of what I grew up thinking was Islam, my brother once pointed out to me, is just dadism. Our dad just kind of picking and choosing what he thought we needed to know about the religion so we wouldn't be completely whitewashed. So I don't, this isn't knocking Islam, because I really didn't have a full understanding of what Islam was. I've come to appreciate it a lot more now as I learn more and more and more about it. But as a kid, I just was scared all the time, and it would make it so I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I would obsessively think about it. And when I finally did sleep, I'd try to sleep for as long as possible, because then at least I wouldn't be thinking. Wow. So it was really intense. And my parents are from a different generation. It was, don't worry and don't talk about it. Like, just all the time. So I kind of bottled everything up and never talked about it, and just tried to pretend everything was okay for a lot of my life.
So when in your 30s, then you found your way to someone who could help you frame what you'd been experiencing?
Yes. And it was it was a lot of different therapy and therapists. And, I was diagnosed with OCD when I was a young teenager, but that was because of my obsessive cleaning. So I do have some kind of more standard OCD and, symptoms. So I do clean obsessively. I do get upset if things are out of place. I do have rage issues, which is why I work out all the time, because then at least I'm too tired to be rageful, or at least too rageful. So I do have some classic symptomology, but it's that the cleaning is just a way of me making my outside world less chaotic than my inside world. It's not really that I care if I don't care fundamentally if things are clean. It's just that I can't stand mess, because everything inside my head is such a mess.
Right. So and this is really important. I mean, I'm so grateful to you that you're just being really honest about this. I feel like it's really hard to find a space where we can talk about spirituality, mental health issues, development, growing, what's inherited in families, where things fall apart, language wise, understanding wise. I mean, you bring all of that just to this conversation, the same as you do to your memoir. It's really, really astonishing the way you're able to do that. So, you come across now as someone in your writing, and just you as a person, as someone who's been as incredibly freed up creatively, right? That somehow you found a language for this. You understand how to storytell around this. You have perspective on yourself, and and your work is really powerful and really accessible. So where did the writerly part come in, and how did that intersect then with the spirituality and mental health for you?
Yeah, well, reading, it all started with reading. I think for a lot of writers, it all starts with reading. So reading was this wonderful escape. And it was also a place where I could start to negotiate things I was feeling, and saw myself reflected in certain characters in certain books. So as I was reading and exploring these worlds, and new worlds were kind of sparking to life in my brain, I started to think, well, what about if I tried doing this, if I tried exploring these things myself? So of course, it started with me as a young child writing. And really interesting, I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, I was on a podcast, which isn't out yet, called Writers Read Their Early Shit. And all we did was talk about our earliest really embarrassing stuff. But even that, for me, was very existential, very dark stuff. And I was so obviously always negotiating with this. So eventually I just started trying to write it out and make sense of things going on in my life that I couldn't make sense of through poems. So my mom has an anxiety and depression. She has an anxiety issue and depression. I'm not going to try to diagnose her. She's been prescribed medication for it, but generalized anxiety and depression. And my mom used to get up, and she'd be all snuggly in bed. And when she got up and would see the house, she'd just lose it, if things were a mess. So I made a little poem about my mom, about her going from nice and snuggling to this raging beast. And all I really remember about it is she's nice and quiet when she's in bed, but when she gets up, something happens in her head. And the poem, and I was a young child, I was 9 or 10 at the time. Yeah. But now looking back, I see so much of myself in that you get out of bed and you emerge into this world. It's just chaos, and just the sadness and frustration and rage. I was very unsympathetic as a child, but now, and as a child, I was also obsessively cleaning too. So I was unsympathetic because she was a mom and she was supposed to be perfect, but I also understood that the mess would be frustrating. So it's always how I've tried to deal with things in my life, is through writing or reading. And, you escape the problems, but you're also negotiating them at the same time.
Yeah, well, that's what's interesting, right? When you're a reader, you're right, because you can enter into all those worlds and those worlds give you perspective. But when you're a writer, you have to negotiate them by recreating those worlds, right? You have to be willing to go to those hard places to talk about those experiences. You have an uncanny ability to do that. So that's really astonishing. And I want people to know that. You're going to read a little bit in a minute from your memoir, but yeah, so a lot of people would have hightailed it the other way and not wanted to write and go to those places, but pretty much stay with this escape and self-medication and that degree of insight. But you've chosen another path, which is really, really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, it was tough because when I first started writing it, and I talked about this in the foreword, is I just thought, okay, I'm going to write about the documented prevalence of eating disorders in biracial women. That's all I'm going to talk about, because I struggle with, on top of everything else, I don't think I've even said this yet, bulimia and anorexia for about just over a decade of my life, and I didn't really want to talk about anything else. I was just going to talk about those things, but everything bleeds. The comorbidity of these diseases is fairly well documented, and it's not uncommon for people with OCD to have issues with addiction and with eating disorders as well. It's incredibly common. So I tried to just talk about this one thing because I didn't want to talk about everything else. I didn't want to be as open as I've learned to be now. But when I was trying to, it was just like, okay, well, I need to talk about other things because everything just keeps bleeding. You try to just stop, but then it doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? So you have more and more and more. And then the question is, how much are you willing to give? And, you don't have to say everything. You don't have to give all of yourself away, but I at least said everything that I wanted to say honestly. And there are some stories I'll always keep to myself and I'll never share with anybody, but I can still tell my story without, feeling like I need the whole world to forgive me, which I think in telling some stories is all I would be looking for, is some kind of forgiveness. So they're going to stay.
That's really interesting. So I want to talk to you about your work as an editor too, but I'm thinking, why don't we go, because we're talking about your memoir, why don't you set up the reading for us and go ahead. Let's go ahead and go into the reading, because I would love for people to hear your voice and the particular, just talk to us about the chapter and that let's just start with that. Let's do that. And then we can pick up on the editorial stuff on the other side of all this.
Sure. So I'm going to be reading from a chapter called The Cosmic Script, and don't really remember how I came up with the title. It's just, I've always been fascinated with the universe and stars and comets and everything that's out there and we know nothing about. So this chapter focuses on an incident when my daughter was younger. My now 10-year-old was younger. I have 4 children. So when my second child, oldest daughter, was younger, and she came into my bed at night, my husband was working nights then, and she had this experience where she woke up and just understood with, again, that bowel quickening certainty that she was going to die and everyone she loved was going to die. Yeah. And she was just so terrified. So this chapter is me, who doesn't pretend to have the answers, trying to talk my way to her and connect with her and give her any kind of certainty without what I would feel is being dishonest to her or tell her stories that I don't necessarily believe myself, but getting her to try to come to answers herself and answers she could live with herself. So I'm going to read the last part of it, so right up to the end. So at this point, Nuala and I have been laying in bed, and I've been talking about OCD and existential OCD and kind of familiarizing the reader with all of that. So I'm just going to kind of dive into the end here.
And your daughter's how old here? She's like 5 or 6, isn't she? She's 6?
Yeah, okay. She's 6, yeah. Chapter, and she's so pretty young, but dealing with the same things. Nuala says, "Can I turn on the light?" I reach over her and switch on my bedside reading lamp. Nuala and I squint each other into focus. I rearrange the pillows, propping myself up into a seated position. Nuala crawls onto my lap, her long legs folding up to her chest. "Ugh," I grunt. "You're getting so big." She looks up into my face. "Gramps says there's a heaven and a God. Are there?" My dad, putting ideas into my children's heads. Maybe he assumed I would have already told my kids about God, or maybe he didn't think about it at all and was just answering a question with his truth. Either way, these concepts are pervasive enough that Nuala was bound to ask me about them eventually. I forced myself to push my agitation with my father aside and think of the interstitium. I'm just going to take a break. I've already discussed that. That's a organ in your body that was recently discovered. I honestly don't know Nuala. I can feel her small beating heart through the side of her rib cage, but I think there could be. Maybe not the God in heaven of religious texts, but something else, some other place we go when we die, some other kind of prime mover. So you don't know. She pushes herself off my chest and looks directly into my eyes. Her voice is becoming pinched, high. I wish Matthew was home. These days he's working nights in the city. I take a deep breath and tuck her hair behind her ear. No, honey, I don't know, not for sure. But here's what I think. I think we know absolutely nothing about anything. I tell her about the interstitium, about the discovery of gravitational waves. I tell her about how the smartest men in the world used to think the Earth was the center of the universe, but now we know it's not, and the universe goes on indefinitely. I tell her about long orbit comets and how they travel through space for millions of years. Who knows where they go? Who knows what they see? We have no idea, Nuala, how big it is, how much is out there, and how little we know. And if our knowledge is imperfect, then our fears are unfounded. This is the same thing I tell myself every day. Her eyes soften, losing their desperate, pleading edge. She puts her head back on my chest, her mass of blonde hair bronzed by the dim light from the lamp. I feel the predictable give of her body into mine. We know so little about life and we're living it. How are we supposed to know anything about death? Nuala looks up at me. It could be anything, she says. It could even be something really amazing. Exactly. Like how when a mother is pregnant with her baby, that child's cells can move into the mother's body and stay with her in her brain and other parts of her body. This means even when you're at school or with Gramps or Nana, you're still with me. People didn't know about that before, but now we do. Nuala puts her hands on either side of my face and peers into my forehead as if she's looking at the cells in my brain, little cosmic specks of herself. That, Nuala said, is pretty amazing. It's strange how you can't see yourself in your children's impossibly clear eyes, but you're all they see. They grew in you, and it didn't happen all at once, but your body's bottomless pit let out their surging light. It's strange how my children come to me in the night, their small, compact bodies sweating bad dreams, how they relax into my umbilical circumference, and I relax into theirs. It's strange how I'm an endless source of comfort for them, and I've never been one for myself.
Wow. That's beautiful. That's really
Thank you.
incredible. That's incredible. I really love that chapter. I'm just so grateful that you read to us from that.
Well, thank you.
Wow. And I love that line. Oh my God, there's so many lines from there. But if our knowledge is imperfect, then our fears are unfounded. Is that right? Am I quoting it right?
Yeah. It's kind of something
Beautiful.
I was working through one day when I was just so scared and so scared and so scared. And I just thought, but you're scared of what? Like you don't even know. Like you don't know. And if it could be anything, then as Nuala so astutely said, it could be something amazing. You don't know.
Yeah.
So that's what we were talking about, living with the questions, like not writing off that there is a God or a heaven, not writing off that maybe there's nothing, not writing off that we just don't know, and maybe we should stop being so scared. Because maybe not being so afraid of the unknown, which is something very hard for someone struggling with existential OCD, because we want control and we want answers and we want it now. But I mean, there is a certain control and surrender. There truly is. And it, took me many decades and a few years of sobriety to get there. But and even sometimes I still struggle. I still have that cold pool of dread in my stomach, but it's less and less now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's something, and I know we need to transition to the writing exercise, but there's something incredible too about having to come up with that kind of having to have that conversation with children, whether there are children or but with a being who has wide open perception, but isn't necessarily sort of educated at the same level that we are at that moment in time. We're having that conversation. So all the places you went with her, it's really astonishing. And you and I talked a bit about this before, right? Our children, if children have that fear of mortality, how do we engage? How do we talk about it? Where do we go with there? And you just took her right out into the cosmos. That was fantastic.
Well,
It's
there's a lot of guilt.
amazing.
Thank you. There's a lot of
Yeah.
guilt. I mean, a little bit earlier in the chapter, and I didn't want to read too long. I talk about the guilt of, you bring these beautiful beings into this world only to fade, flicker, and die. How could you?
Exactly.
How could you be selfish? And this, it was my daughter was having a moment, but my oldest son actually suffers from existential anxiety at the very least. He's only 11. We haven't tried to diagnose him yet, but he goes to therapy and he's fine with me talking about this, he said, but he struggles a lot with these dreading, these questions of dread. Yeah. And, it's very difficult. And it's I have a lot of those moments of how could you? So I feel like I need to have the conversations with them and what do you think? What do you think happens? They're closer to the other side of the mountain than I am. Yeah. They're closer, they have a better, I believe they have a clearer sight than I do. What's going on?
They're only 6 and 11 years in. Yeah, that's right. So they're closer to the veil, That's true. That's true, right? And they don't have that fixed categorizing that we do just to function as adults, right? They're just things are so alive for them. I know my kids at 4 and 6, right? They were they get reincarnated as a TV or, or a reindeer, whatever. It'll all feel good on the other side. What's not to like.
I love the video you sent me that your daughter did when there was a little flashback to them talking about it. It was just a gorgeous video.
Yeah, well, thank you. But that's the part of the project, right? Of just sort of moving through life with children or whoever is sent to you to negotiate those things with, where you have to kind of pause and get out of yourself and think, that's right. What do we say about this? How do we talk about this? I used to call it the cosmic despondencies, kind of where do we go with this? Where do we, I would have been a child much like you, not happy with the heaven is great, we'll get there. But Nuala, I don't know, I might have to take some lessons from Nuala. You might need to put me on her party list, okay? I think I have to have a conversation.
We always tell her you're going to take
the right attitude, that girl. I love that. Okay, so we'll cycle back around to this, but let's segue in because we want to make this participatory for everyone. Talk to us a bit about what you've got for the writing exercise and why. And while you're setting that up, I'll go ahead and just pull up the PowerPoint too. But talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so I wanted to do an exercise that involves surrealism. So I think surrealism, because it involves non sequiturs and kind of semantic thinking, or somnatic thinking, sorry, not semantic, somnatic thinking, and just letting your brain go and pick up on natural things around you. I think that's a very spiritual experience, and so I wanted to get people to focus on inanimate objects specifically. So look, I've written, look around you, all the stuff around you, and write from the perspective of something as opposed to someone. So these sentient objects, whether it's a desk, a chair, a lamp, what if these things weren't inanimate? What would they do? So if it's a toaster and you're making breakfast, how are you being perceived, or how is a character you're writing about being perceived by the toaster? If you're a nightmare, right from the perspective of the sheets. The point is to get out of your own head, experience existence as not someone else, but something else.
Okay. So hold that thought. Hold on.
Yeah.
So we'll just do. Okay. Are you? Is everyone seeing this now? Is the screen up? Can you see it?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So then here we go. Wait 1 sec. Here's the contact info. So this will appear as part of the recording, so everyone has a chance to understand how to get a hold of Hollay, and Mary Jane will also put this information into the chat. And here you go. So you can just go back through it again and just read it. And how much time do you want to give people to kind of play with this exercise?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably 5 minutes is enough, unless you think more. Because I mean, I'm trying to be really specific, right? Yeah. You don't have to write about a lot of things, just write about one thing.
Okay.
And
So why don't
yeah,
you just go through this slide, and then I think the exercise on the next slide, and then that way everybody can kind of follow what you're saying visually here too. You okay with
sure.
that? Okay.
Yeah. So why use surrealism in writing? Look around you. Chances are you're surrounded by inanimate objects, desks, chairs, desks, lamps, etc. But what if these things weren't inanimate? What if they were sentient and could react to your life or the life of a character you're developing? Not every story will lend itself to this surrealist slant, but those that do benefit from making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Surrealism can challenge and subvert what and how we perceive the world around us, leading us to new, profound realizations. So, the writing exercise. Write from the perspective of an object as opposed to a person. This object is using its senses to describe you or a character performing some action. Maybe you're making toast and being perceived by the toaster, or having a nightmare and being perceived by the sheets. The point is to get out of your own head and experience existence as something, not just someone else.
Beautiful. Okay, so we'll time it for 5 minutes, and we'll leave that slide up, and we'll reconnect in 5. How is that?
Sounds good.
Beautiful. Two minutes left. Hmm. 30 seconds. There we go. Okay, so here's, we're going to wrap this up in a moment and just open up to conversation. So the last slide that'll be on the recording shows you how to find the memoir, a little bit more about surrealism, some great examples of flash fiction, if you want to check that out as well, and an indie Canadian press with the dog book imprint specializing in surrealist poetry is Anvil Press. And there's a way to connect with that as well. Okay, I'm going to hit stop share. And we can still, let's open, I think we should probably stop the recording so we can open it up to Q&A, because I think people are really going to want to have a conversation with you and talk about where this has taken them. So